Hello everybody and welcome to Hamburger Bahnhof and to our third kind of conversation in this series, In Conversation, which is very generously supported by Deutsche Bank Art and Culture. Thank you so much for coming today. I know we have major competition with the sun and the good weather. So it's really nice to see many people on a Saturday afternoon, some friends, some colleagues, great artists that we have worked with also. So it's really a lovely, lovely gathering. And the idea here is to really keep these conversations as informal and as personable as possible. So, you know, I noticed that on the front desk there was a notice about the talk saying Expertengespräch. I was like, wow, we're experts. We have a very expert talk. I cannot say how delighted we are that today our guests are probably a staple, an iconic brand in a sense, but also two wonderful human beings that we've had the chance to know for so many years and to kind of grow into our practice also together, us as curators and working institutionally, and of course them as artists. So there's a lot to talk about, and just in case you don't know who the artists of today's talk are, we're very happy to have with us Elmgreen Dragset, Ingar and Michael. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a true pleasure to have you and to kind of get a glimpse, a little bit of your practice, the development of your work. How do you work together, some of the important projects, your connection to Berlin, and also your thinking and questions about arts at large, collaboration, maybe the future. But maybe it's always good to start at the beginning. And the first thing that maybe we can talk about, and I will let you kind of take it from there, is kind of how did you start working together? Where did you meet? And what were the beginnings like? And from there on, we can take it more into maybe what prompted you to come to Berlin. But where did the beginning start for each one of you separately, and how did that encounter happen?
Well, the first meeting was not very artistic. We met in Copenhagen in a gay club called After Dark. Michael pretended to be very shy, so I was like dancing around for 2 hours until we finally got in contact and started talking, and then went to a bar across the street, got very drunk and had to walk home together, and we realized that we lived in the same street, in the same building, and you know, that was the beginning of a very, very, very long friendship. We were a couple for the first 10 years of our collaboration, but continued then working together after we split up around.
So Michael, 2004. Now you tell us the real story. Now you tell us the real story.
Yeah, exactly.
You looked a bit skeptical.
No, actually our start of collaboration happened because I had done a few art projects. I actually came from poetry, but as anyone knows, like poetry books are selling in very small amounts, and if you go to Denmark, that is a very small language zone, then it sells in maybe 50 copies. So it was a bit depressing that you worked a long time for something that would have very little outcome. And I started doing some projects on computer screens where text would morph, and I had to show them somewhere. And I went to a Kunsthalle in Copenhagen and said, can I show this? I'm not an artist. I didn't know that you couldn't do that in the art world. And of course they said no. And they were polite. They took my phone number, and then they called me a month later because they had got a cancellation, and they said, what about these poems? Can you come and fill up the gap? And then I did that, and then it became visual art because some students from the academy started inviting me to shows and whatever. And then I met this guy who came from theater. And then we had to decide, well, what do we do together? And we started doing some performances where we knitted different objects and also dresses for ourselves and were unraveling them on each other. So it was a slow motion peep show. And he could knit and I could unravel.
There you have the roles.
So what's happening in the slide that we have here?
Well, through those first performances, we kind of realized that the art world and gallery spaces, museum spaces, were much more controlled and rigid and conventional than we had thought. We thought maybe that the art world was very experimental, fun, very gay, and then you make your first performances and you realize that people find it strange, or you're supposed to behave in this or that way, and every opening looks more or less the same, and we started looking at what are these structures around us. What is the white cube that is the sort of main kind of space to show art in? And after a couple of years of collaboration, we did this performance that is called 12 Hours of White Paint. And that's basically what we did. We painted this white cube gallery white for 12 hours from midday to midnight. And by adding more of the material that the white cube is made up of, white paint, it sort of started to dissolve and take on its own kind of identity. You could maybe say that we were queering the space to some extent.
And how successful was that performance, in your opinion, looking back?
Well, this was part of a performance festival, actually, in Odense. So some of the old Fluxus artists were present in this small city in Denmark. And they are very patient as an audience, so they would come back sort of like the whole performance, to check in on us and see how we were doing. And in that sense, I felt it felt like an important work because it sort of connected a bit to art history in that sense as well. But we got terribly poisoned afterwards. We couldn't wake up the next morning. This was before ecological paint, without it, that's how old we are. But we couldn't wake up. They had to call security in the hotel to sort of shake us awake the next day.
Michael?
Yeah, I think starting out doing our live acts was partly also the reason for us moving to Berlin, because the art scene in Scandinavia at that time was rather conservative. We were quite classic-oriented, and people really hated what we did. So we were like, okay, let's try to go south. We didn't have much money, so we had for a bus ticket to come to Berlin. But we also, by coincidence, started to do our first sculptures. We were invited for a show for young artists in Louisiana Museum, north of Copenhagen. And we were supposed to do a performance there, but we were invited so late that all the rooms were already taken by the other artists. So there was not really a space for a performance left for us. And then we saw this beautiful room that had not been used for art presentations before. It was a viewing room with sofas. And hi. And then we came up with the idea for our first sculpture. a diving board that would penetrate this panoramic window where the board would go through the window glass and having the base inside. So we somehow also had a sort of institutional critique in that work, like poking a hole in the precious membrane of the art institution out to the natural environment around it.
Well, in a sense, it kind of connects with that thinking that also, Ingar, you were just talking about, like thinking about the white cube, thinking about the confines of that space in which art can exist and operate. And here you're kind of taking the thinking and pushing it out of the space literally and metaphorically. I can also think how our conservators would love this kind of project, because you're opening the window in a museum and it's a sculpture, and what happens to it 3 months later? Is the climate going to affect the color of the paint, and how do we conserve it? So it's a lot of challenges in many, many ways. So you came to Berlin after that project. That was kind of one of the projects before you moved here. In 1997, was it?
Yeah, it was sort of at that time. You could say the diving board is almost pointing to Berlin.
And it's still there, actually, surviving.
Well, this is actually almost the same time as Hamburger Bahnhof opened as a museum in 1996. So, but maybe can you say something about the reason why you then moved to Berlin, and what was your impression? I mean, did you know the city, or how did you feel? What was the big change for you guys, saying that it was conservative and, you know, white cubes, and something that you keep obviously continuing to challenge and push in your practice in so many different ways? But what was your starting point here in Berlin?
Well, Copenhagen started to feel a little bit small for what we were doing, and Berlin was very close. As Michael said, it was, you know, a cheap bus ticket to get down here. It was very easy then. I'm sorry for the young people today, but then it was very easy to find a place to live. There were a lot of apartments and spaces for free. Not for free, but were free, often with coal heating and maybe no shower, but we didn't care at all, of course. We were just happy to find this apartment in Prenzlauer Berg first, and later on in Mitte. And in the photo, that's our first studio, actually, in Schönhausallee, number 8. That is now going through a huge transformation, that whole area. It's quite interesting to go and look at that now, actually, like, you know, behind the barn there. But Berlin, what can you say? A lot of people like to romanticize the 90s, of course, the 2000s, and it was a fantastic time in many ways. But the scene was very small and strangely also kind of monocultural, you know, like it has opened up to a much broader, much more diverse art world now. The good thing in the 90s was, of course, that many of us would know each other. You would go to the same bars, the same places, the same club. Everyone kind of knew each other, and it felt very safe and a great place to develop new things, because you feel this safety and security somehow. And space is so important, of course. Like there was this thing that some of you might remember called Zwischennutzung, for instance. There was lots of empty storefronts, and in those storefronts you could just talk to the house owner or the Hausverwaltung, and they would let you sometimes use that space for some months or a few years even, to run a bar, a club or a little gallery or something. So it was very dynamic, I would say, in that sense.
It was very easy to be broke, and because everyone were more or less, and there was not so much about status. It was also very undefined what would happen the next year. There wasn't a master plan of what would be the cool gallery area, or what gallery would be the leading gallery, and so on. So it was very free to come from outside and not having to fit into an already established structure. But it was also terrible. I mean, at that time, there was such a romantic notion of doing art. So when Inga and I came in our hoodies and our sneakers to an opening, they came up to us and asked immediately, "Are you here for the beers?" Because we didn't look like a German avant-garde artist had to look at that time.
Cologne style.
And also, you would be labeled as a queer artist, the gay artist at that time, together with a few others like Kai Althoff and Lukas Dövenöger and whatever. We were the gay artist. There has been a really positive development concerning diversity in Berlin, I think. So today there is an openness towards art practices that are different from a more kind of romantic artist role.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a sense, you arrived at Berlin at the maybe beginning of those shifts that were starting to happen. And by the same token, one could say that that was a very important period because at the time you also managed to land into the first Berlin Biennale, and you won the prize of the Nationalgalerie, the second edition in 2002, which we are having this year in Berlin, at the Hamburger Bahnhof in June. So there were some important steps, in a sense, that Berlin gave you, more visibility, more connections. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about these projects, or were you expecting to win the prize of the Nationalgalerie as these two guys in sneakers coming with their hoodies in 2022, a few years after you arrived?
No, not at all. But maybe we talk a little bit about this piece first.
Absolutely.
Because this is our contribution to the first Berlin Biennial, which was in 1998. It was curated by Klaus Biesenbach and Nancy Spector from Guggenheim Museum and Hans-Ulrich Obrist. Our work, some of you might recognize these doors. It's from Postforamt in Mitte. That was one of the venues, but we chose to be outside, just by the entrance, and it's kind of a wishing well, but it's sealed up. And the work really is about this time starting to change already. You know, Mitte was already, you could sense what's about to come. And this piece sort of questions like, what kind of wishes and dreams do we have for the future? How do we, sort of hang on to them? And here, of course, it's like a sealed up wishing well that you can walk on. It sort of stays there as a time capsule in a way. Here's someone visiting from Bavaria, I think. And then we go to Hamburger Bahnhof.
We recognize these galleries. I think
This
I
is
see
like,
the same.
it's upstairs.
It's
like
above.
that, yeah.
Yeah, he had a view directly to Charité, the sick man in the hospital bed. We were very surprised because we were absolutely not. I think that they sometimes make kind of bets on who is winning, and I think we were absolutely getting the biggest amount of money if we would win. So because we were the lowest rated, we were so sure that we wouldn't win that we were on our way. It was announced on the outside in the garden, and we were on our way out when they said our names, and we didn't know, we hadn't prepared anything to say. But a week before, we had been very drunk in a Antifa gay club in Mitte that is not existing anymore, called the Ackerkeller. And in
Okay, we have some fans in the house.
in Ackerkeller, we had promised them that if anything went very unexpected and we would win the prize, we would give them a new fridge because the beers were always warm. So for our thank you speech when getting the prize, the only thing we could come up with was saying, shit, now we need to give Aga Keller a new fridge, because you won money at that time. And of course, like all the German newspapers, loved that the money from the Preis der Nationalgalerie would go to a Schwulenclub in a basement somewhere in Mitte.
So that was, in a sense, a little bit of an insight into those formative, let's say, years, the early years in Berlin, and from there things grow and expand, and we start seeing Elmgreen Dragset pop up in different places. And maybe what's exciting is that the work doesn't get confined only within the institution, but you start making a practice that infiltrates all these public spaces and kind of changes our perception of how we see these things, and how you create a new space of those spaces that are otherwise familiar. Or so maybe we can talk a little bit about that and kind of talk us through some of the projects. Like, this is the Galleria in Milano. What was happening there? How did you come up with this idea? And this was 2004.
Sorry, it's 3. Yeah. So, through this shows like the biennial and probably the prize here and such exhibitions, people started to notice our work also beyond the borders of Scandinavia and Germany. And this piece that we see here was curated by a very, very young curator called Massimiliano Gioni. It was his first project, and it was with the Trussardi Foundation in Milan. And they gave us this incredible site to develop a project. It's the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele in the center of the city. And of course, this is called like the living room of Milan. It really points in 4 directions, between the bank, the famous Scala opera, the politicians, and so on. And it even has like murals up under the cupola of the 4 corners of the world, meaning that this is really the center. So we wanted to counterpoint this with a sort of very nomadic and seen as something like maybe a lower entity of architecture to counter this grandness somehow.
Yeah, the car had number plates from Napoli, because the people in Milano are very snob. They look down on the south and also think they can't drive. And then it had a card, like a road map in the window, so you could see it was on its way to Rimini. That is a big holiday destination for campers.
I mean, perhaps on that note, a lot of your works actually exist in the public place. And maybe it is interesting to talk a little bit about why that is important to you. And at the same time, there's a lot of humor in these works. You go into this gallery and see something that you would have never expected. You get thrown out of your comfort zone. You see something you would have never seen and you will probably never see again. But at the same time, they're very familiar things somehow. You recognize the camper van, you recognize the car, certainly not in that combination, and for sure not in that particular location. But can you talk a little about maybe this sense of humor or this interaction with the public in your art and the importance of that, and why this is something that keeps happening in your practice?
I mean, if you do outdoor pieces, you meet your audience in a different manner, because you can't choose them. If you do institutional shows, you more or less know what type of people will come according to where the institution is, how the institution has profiled itself, etc. That has, of course, other advantages. But it's fun for you as an artist to do something where you will have a lot of unexpected encounters. And a work like this, for instance, was acquired by MCA in Chicago later on, was in front of the museum. And we were part of a show in Chicago, and they had installed this piece in front of the museum, and we sit in a taxi, and the cab driver is saying to us, well, we make a little detour. I switch off the meter because I'm going to show you something. He didn't know who we were. And he was passing by this work, and he said, "Isn't that bonkers? I mean, they call it art. I call it bad driving." And that is a big pleasure of doing an outdoor project that is communicating with people in a different way, because people have a different kind of relation to art that is put
I mean, on that note, I mean, I was going to talk about it later, but I think it fits so well here. You know, you're also part of our Endless exhibition project, which unites works that are permanently installed here in the context of Hamburger Bahnhof. So if you have some time afterwards, I invite you to pick one up, one of these leaflets. And one of the pieces is actually here in the garden. It's this ATM machine called the Statue of Liberty, with an ATM machine put into a piece of the Berlin Wall, and the ATM pointing to the west. And we have similar experiences when we sit in the garden. Now you can have coffees outside. We regularly see lines of people waiting to withdraw money, you know, so the first person goes and it's not working, and the second person then goes, and I always find it really fun to watch that. And I think it's such a great way, because it places art in daily life. It doesn't become a holy object, but it really does something. And maybe you don't recognize it's art, but you certainly have a reaction to it. And
Till, I think we should ask them to replenish the machine every week. I mean, we're always looking for money. Absolutely. So please, we expect the delivery on Monday. I mean, if you think these projects are bonkers as the taxi driver, probably the next one is one of the most iconic projects that many people recognize. And you can tell us a little bit, what prompted this? How did you arrive to this idea? And
there's a bone to pick. We went all the way to Marfa, and the shop was closed.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
And the car broke down.
We make you so many useless things. It's like yeah, I mean, maybe the idea partly came from working in Milan, where, of course, the fashion industry is so strong. And in between, we did another project in New York at a gallery called Tanya Bonaktar Gallery. And that was one of the first galleries that moved to Chelsea, you know, from East Village, or not from East Village, from Soho. And it was all these expectations to Chelsea. You could see it was developing very fast. And we closed the facade of her gallery there, saying, "Opening soon, Prada," which was, of course, not true, but we had sort of mimicked a situation that was happening in Soho, where there used to be a downtown Guggenheim. And that was about to be changed to
Prada shop.
Huge Prada shop by Rem Koolhaas that is still there. And we thought this was maybe also happening in this area, you know, like what kind of discussions can we have around this development? Tanya was not so happy because, of course, nobody entered the gallery. Everyone called her and said, "Sorry, you're going out of business, but who's designing the shop? Is it Rem?" Or, you know.
Do you still work with Tanya?
No.
Clearly.
No, that was not so successful. That was the end. Anyway, we realized like what a kind of immense power this sort of, urban signifiers have. Like, of course, these commercial stores. And we wanted to see what happens if you take it completely out of context and sort of bring it on a survival trip, so to speak, to the desert. And with Art Production Fund in New York, we found this incredible site close to Marfa. That's also
which is also still like an hour drive. I mean, I think the next inhabitable place with any building is a good hour drive from there. It is really, really in a very remote location. So
it's 3 hours from the biggest city.
You don't find any such place in Europe anymore.
And the interesting thing is that this work was kind of pre-social media. It was in the beginning of Facebook, but it was like only some weirdos being on Facebook at that time. And it was definitely long before Instagram. So we thought that this work would be a strange time capsule that would fall apart over time. Only very few people would know about it. And that is, of course, something that didn't happen. The opposite happened through mediation on social media, but it was so not planned. At the opening, we were like maybe 50 people, mostly locals, listening to country music and drinking tequila. It was for the very few. But then over time, like, yeah, it was used in different ways, like from pop stars posing in front of it to Simpsons including it in one of their series. So sometimes you do projects where your intentions are completely different from what the project turns out to be. Suddenly it became a pop cultural icon. We thought it was a critique of the luxury goods industry and a new take on land art, because we love these land art projects that were really hard to access and that just existed outside any kind of audience. And then, yeah, the opposite happened. And that's quite beautiful because, like, as artists, when you do your works, it's like having teenage kids. You need to let them grow into something on their own and move from home, and you can't control them anymore.
Well, I guess this is exactly when the artwork enters the public domain, you have to abandon it and let it do what it needs to do, and it acquires a new meaning, a new perception, because you cannot control how people will interpret or respond or experience that. Moving on from there, I think this is the time when Venice called. It's kind of, you know, the young couple coming into Berlin in their sneakers, and 10 years later, no, 2011 or?
Yeah, 12. No, this is 2009.
2009, exactly. So Venice calls, and I guess a lot of artists, for them to represent, to be in a national pavilion at the Venice Biennale is kind of like the Oscars of the arts world, or the equivalent of winning the Nobel Prize, or whatever you want to call it, or maybe the opposite. And in your case, you weren't content with only one national pavilion. You actually did 2 national pavilions, and they were right next to each other. So please talk to us about that, and what was your experience, in a sense, representing a nation or a culture, knowing that all your work has been about pushing the boundaries, breaking these categories, and here you are invited to fit in a certain framework. How did you negotiate that seeming contradiction, in a sense, and how did you play with it, and what happened there?
Yeah, of course, it was a sort of slightly absurd situation for us, but it so happened, you know, Michael and I come from 2 different countries. I'm from Norway, and Michael's from Denmark, and I think we got invited by Norway first, who had the Nordic Pavilion that year. And then it turned out that Denmark also had been interested in showing us that year. So the Arts Councils of the 2 countries started talking together, and I think it's the first time that it happened that, you know, someone got 2 pavilions, basically. We went there to sort of, you know, look at the pavilions, slightly daunted by the challenge, but realized that when you walk there sort of off-season, the Giardini area where these pavilions are, it almost looks like a kind of posh neighborhood, you know, like it's sort of like a villa quartier.
Grunewald.
Yeah, something like that. And we thought maybe we use that as a starting point, you know, sort of bring it home, literally. And from that, we started to develop an idea around building 2 homes. using the architecture as a starting point. And we thought, like, but somebody has to live in these homes, and what is interesting to talk about today? And what was happening very much at this time was talk about collecting, but more like collecting as investment. You know, it was an over-focus on who's the next big things, auction prices, blah, blah, blah. And we felt as young-ish artists that this was so wrong, because we knew many collectors that collect for all kinds of different reasons, right? So we said, let's open also this as a debate around what collecting can be and what it shows about us as humans and our desires and identities and so on. And the next step was that we felt like we need more people to help us tell these stories. So we invited 23 other artists from many different backgrounds, many different countries to take part and help us transform these pavilions. And maybe I can start with just saying that this is in front of the Danish pavilion. We also involved 2 British performers that took the role of real estate agents, because we had to sort of do kind of guided tours. So they had a difficult job of trying to sell the Danish pavilion. That was kind of, breaking apart, because this was, in our narrative, the home of a family about to break apart. You could clearly see the dramas happening in the house, because they all were sort of very different from each other, obsessed with very different things in their lives.
That was the Danish pavilion, whereas like the Nordic pavilion that we didn't want to sell because it's more beautiful, was turned into kind of look-alike Californian case study house. It's very transparent, very open and elaborate architecture, and we made it into kind of a gay bachelor pad, where the guy living there was also collecting according to his sexual desires. The guards were young men hanging out in the chairs, on the couches, or in the bed, while he was outside, floating. We come to that. Face down, after maybe too much partying, or maybe after having had too much fun. It was sort of maybe also us killing the old stereotype of the rich gay man living in a wealthy environment. And it was a signal from our side of now it's maybe time to think about our categories of identities in a different manner.
I think this is something that maybe whenever Till and I have discussed your work in our curatorial practice, and we've worked together, in one of our exhibitions in SCAD in 2019, I think that was, or 20, it was just at the beginning of COVID, and we included one of the works that appears in the pavilion in our exhibition, the 2 urinals that are so here you have the 2 sinks, but we had the 2 urinals. This idea of relationships and the complexities of relationships and the intertwinement, maybe we can ask another question while we look at future projects, the collaborative aspect of your work. I mean, it comes with advantages. It comes also with challenges, clearly, because we're also collaborating all the time. And maybe it would be interesting to hear a little bit about how did you find your position in this kind of collaboration? How do you approach a project when an idea starts with either one of you? Or maybe we can take one of the future projects as an example. If you think about the plinth in Trafalgar Square, That was a project that came with a parameter, in a sense. You would.
Sure, but maybe this is a good,
this is a good
place
example,
to start,
yeah.
because also it's a piece that was made exactly around the time that we split up as a couple. So, you know, it's called Marriage, and it shows the difficulties of marriage, maybe through this intricate, complicated drainage system. And maybe when you drain the water in Bonn, dirt water comes up in the other side or the other way around. And of course, splitting up, continuing to work together is basically also just shifting the focus and continuing a sort of marriage, say. That's as complicated as this, but as what's complicated can also be very beautiful somehow. It doesn't have to be negative. Conflict is also good, discussion is good. I think in the collaboration it's incredibly important to allow for this, you know, individual sort of traits to come out. Discussions need to be had, and yeah, we shouldn't be afraid of them.
It also started at a time and back in Scandinavia where it was not so unusual to collaborate. Like there were whole artist groups like Superflex, or there were like a lot of collaborations because we didn't give a shit about authorship. I mean, that was not why we were doing our stuff. The funny thing is, our very corporate sounding label, Elmgreen Dragset, was never done by us. We were called our full names, but actually when it was a Berlin biennial already, they said, you take up too much space on the invitation card. I mean, we have to shorten this. Can we call you Elmgreen Dragset? And we were like, yeah, whatever. And then this kind of weird name stuck with us, which is sounding a bit like an old lawyer's company or something like that. But it was not by choice.
Well, I was thinking more Dolce & Gabbana since you did Prada.
No, but that's the thing. It's like, you know, some countries, even Elmgreen Dragset is terribly complicated. Like in Italy, for years, they called us Bang & Olufsen. Bang & Olufsen. So it's like, you know, it's like...
But you know what's also very weird is that people choose these things for you. Like, whenever we get emails, nobody ever says Till and Sam. I don't know why. It's always Sam and Till. We have another artist couple here, Kennedy and Swan. They were actually in the same exhibition in SCAD that you were also in, because it was about artist collaboration.
There's another one also called Ben and Sebastian.
There we go. So, but I think this question of authorship is something that maybe a lot of younger artists also deal with when you're starting out, and whether you're a curator, whether you're an artist, you're trying to carve a path for yourself. And the world always tells you it's about your mark, it's about your name, you have to look out for yourself. There's a lot of ego involved. And of course, it's not an easy circle to navigate. But then I think the examples of collaboration, the examples of successful kind of collectivity coming together and being able to put away the ego and think together about what is best for this project, what is the ideal way in which we can make each other work better, be better at what we do, is something very, very special and beautiful, because you have someone who's witnessing also these things with you that you cannot ever explain to somebody else who's not involved in this process, in the time, in the energy that goes into what it takes to do something like, for instance, your fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square.
But I would also say it's just a formal way of presenting that you collaborate. Like almost every single artist is collaborating on a certain level, at least if they have some friends. They speak with their colleagues about their working process. If they run a studio where they have people helping them, they definitely do, because we are not only collaborating in between us, we have an amazing team in the studio that are helping us making things coming from idea to being executed and becoming a reality. And you collaborate with curators and critics and the audience. I mean, it's a dialogue, but we are kind of open about it. In the 60s in America, you have so many examples of male artists becoming extremely successful, and most of the works were actually made by their female spouse, who never got the same kind of credit for being part of the process. So I don't think it's so mysterious to work together. Art making is somehow a constant dialogue.
Yes, I agree with everything that you said.
No, we have to
better
make
not
sure
say anything.
that we all equally speak, you know, like that I can feel we're always like moderating. Everyone is getting enough time on the panel, which is very, very important, of course, because I get to talk a lot, so I have to keep myself in check. Let's talk a little bit, perhaps, again, for the third time, if you pick up my cue, the fourth plinth at Trafalgar Square. What was happening there?
I don't know if everyone's familiar with the fourth plinth, but it's an ongoing project in London. It's happening on Trafalgar Square.
Sorry, coincidentally, the last artist we had, Rachel White-Read, also
she was one of the
artists who did the fourth plinth.
Fantastic projects. Of course, she made a cast of the plinth, right, and put it on top. Wonderful. We came a few years later, and we took the starting point in Trafalgar Square being even a square named after a battle and has a lot of very serious-looking, imposing men on horses and generals and warlords around on different plinths on the square. And we wanted to counter this narrative somehow by presenting a kid on a rocking horse, something that's a bit more innocent and maybe points to a more positive future. This is from the opening, and this opening happened in 2012. That was the year of the Olympics in London, and Boris Johnson was still the mayor, and at some point there was like the question of moving the opening because Boris Johnson could not come and inaugurate this work on that date. And we said, that's perfect. We don't want him. It's like, and then they asked, but who? We need someone to open the exhibition. And they said, yeah, we have an idea. We collaborated with this wonderful woman a few months ago. So we invited Patsy.
Joanna Lumley, of course.
Joanna Lumley from
or as we know her as
absolutely
Patsy. In
fabulous. It's from a fantastic, TV series in the 90s and 2000s, I guess, in Britain. But Joanna Lumley is like a household name in England. She's very political. She's very, she's a larger-than-life personality. So it was a great opening in the end.
Yeah, it was a big luck that we didn't have him opening. He got himself in when it was Katharina Fritsch, and he denied to call her work a big blue cock, what it was. But he tried to describe it in all other kind of ways because he was very embarrassed about it. Also at the press conference, he was starting to speak about our sculpture was about Britain winning gold in the Olympics, and I took the microphone out of his hand and said, I think I need to correct you here because it's gibberish. He was quite disastrous in his mayor role for these commissions.
So there are so many great episodes, you guys are great storytellers, but I think maybe in the interest of time, we can maybe go through the next slides a bit more quickly, the next works, and move to the question of how your work that so brilliantly sits in these very strange places. And you started, in a sense, with the White Cube project, challenging this very notion of white cubes. But then again, you are also artists that are often shown in museums. So maybe we can go through some of those projects moving ahead, and then also going to the project you did, the brilliant fun project at the Whitechapel Gallery, and maybe seeing how does your work that is so much in the public space actually, how does it also exist in the museum context, not just in a garden, but actually inside those white walls, and what do you do with these white walls when it does happen that you're actually in a more traditional museum setting?
We can just move quickly through a couple of other artworks that are shown in public space. This is our take on the Little Mermaid, the famous sculpture in Copenhagen, but we made a male counterpart, you can say, in the city of Elsinore, below the Kronborg castle, the setting for Shakespeare's Hamlet. Another example of an outdoor sculpture is this pool on Rockefeller Plaza in New York. It seems like an alien object has landed there. It's like a sort of typical garden pool raised on top of its end corner, end edge.
The title is very interesting.
Fun.
The title of this piece.
The title is Van Gogh's Air. The inspiration was initially, kidney-shaped pools and David Hockney's famous pool, for instance, in Los Angeles. But in the process, we sort of maybe it's a bit more like an air, and then thereof the title in the end.
And it's in such an iconic location and right in the heart of Manhattan. It certainly has a lot of humorous connotations.
Yeah, it was another place that's fun to observe people's reaction and surprise, of course. That's came a little bit after.
Into what you speak about. This is our exhibition from 2018 at the Whitechapel Gallery in London, and is an example together with our Venice project, where we turned the pavilions into domestic settings. Here we turned Whitechapel into a public pool. In the beginning, we started to do our critique of the rigid physical structures of the white cube. Why did they look exactly the same no matter where you would go in the world? They're more similar than Burger Kings and other things around the world. The white cube look exactly the same no matter where you are, more or less. But we quite quickly realized that the white cube was not going to change because we were stating our critique of it. It functioned quite well on its own premises. So if something had to change, it was us actually changing it, dressing it in drag for a certain period of time. So when people would come into the room, they would have an impression of being in a setting that would not be a museum setting. And often we take our starting point in the architectural features, but also in the social context of where the institution is. Whitechapel was placed in a part of East London where a lot of public spaces had been closed down by our dear Boris Johnson during his period as mayor. Like a lot of youth clubs, a lot of libraries, and also in the UK, a lot of public pools that were in less posh areas where you felt, oh yeah, no one will really notice if we close down these very important kind of meeting places for neighborhoods. And it was fun when we made that pool a lot of people thought that Whitechapel had been a public pool before. There were even some people that claimed that they had been there as children.
That's right.
When it was a pool, but Whitechapel is actually purpose-built white cube for art presentation.
But really, I mean, also as a visitor coming to the Whitechapel many times, and then you go into this space, and it's really in a very busy neighborhood in the east of London, and a big subway station nearby, a big migrant community, and you go into this building, and it's a complete alienation. You know, this is the last thing you expect. And there is something about it that it's just so crazy that you think it's actually true, I think. You know, you think you play often in your practice with that you pause for a minute, like with the ATM or other things. Could it actually be an ATM, or could it actually be, you know, you just dug up the floor and the new projects that excavate again the history? Is that actually the foundation of the building? And I think you did it so brilliantly, and it really plays with that notion of truth, which makes it very relevant, I think, in the current context as well. And what is real and what is fictional? What is a real history, and what are we made to believe?
And for us, it's also nice to experience that visitors to the exhibitions approach the sculptural works in a different manner than if you have them in a traditional white cube setting. It's more an approach that is about what does that object tell me? Why is it placed there? And far less about, is it good art or is it art at all? All these, for me, quite irrelevant discussions are eliminated if you make the setting different.
How do you feel?
I feel fantastic.
Is this a good place to stop? Do you want to open up to the
yeah,
floor?
I mean, I think maybe one last question maybe before we also, of course, want to open up to the audience and allow all of you to pose some questions. But where do you feel your practice stands now? And, you know, you're coming from such different backgrounds in the sense of not perhaps being the most traditional art school students, and you're merging these backgrounds and your practices, moving away from performance to really this environmental installations, these kind of fake realities, or commenting on histories with a lot of humor and stories. Where do you feel you sit now in your practice, and what do you think is a challenge, or where do you see yourselves moving into the future? Like, what is there some crazy thing that you were hoping to do, or where do you stand now? What's Elmgreen Dragset in 10? Where do you see yourselves in 10 years' time?
Well, you know, since the beginning, since our early performances, our work has been a lot about our bodies in relation to space, in relation to architecture. How are we controlled and directed by the spaces around us, and what kind of power mechanisms are embedded into these spaces and so on. And of course now the world is moving very fast. I mean, of course we moved into the digital era quite a while ago already, and then with the social media and the digital reality in general, you know, we're moving more and more onto our screens now. Artificial intelligence is going to direct a lot of how we see the world and so on. So there's a lot to catch up on all the time. You know, where are we with our bodies? Where do we want them to be? What do we want these bodies to be in the future? And maybe I can just flip through some slides from our recent show at Fondazione Prada in Milan. It was actually called Useless Bodies, ? Because what is a useless body? Today in society, what do we use the bodies for now that we're not really actually producing with them, and we're not even consumers? We are more maybe the material or the information that is sold online. So our bodies have become products now more than ever, and we don't have any answers. I mean, here we try to juxtapose some of our own art with classical and neoclassical sculptures to see what kind of lineage can be found maybe around masculinity, more in this presentation. In the same institution upstairs, we did this office landscape that we called Garden of Eden. This is, of course, very much the situation we had during COVID, but it has also somehow continued afterwards. There's a lot of office buildings empty around the world because also companies realized, oh, we don't need to pay for these office spaces, or people can just work from home. Therefore, we also created this kind of show home, a sort of neo-futuristic, very cold, very
with an AI pet, robotic
yeah,
pet.
With the only living presence was in a way this dog that was a robotic dog, and the morgue at the end. You know, everyone wants to live forever. The furniture very uncomfortable, and then the end was a series of installations that was more like a sort of old school spa, talking about our way of optimizing or believing we have to optimize our bodies constantly nowadays.
As you might notice, like many of the same works are put into new constellations, like we are changing according to time or where we are. The works are also performing different roles according to what kind of setting we place them in. It's not like our works are such masterpieces that they will say exactly the same no matter what situation you put them in. They are playing along, and we use them in a quite ruthless way as props in our different exhibitions to tell different stories. Also, what you might notice is many of these installations are relatively narrative. And is there something that is looked down upon in the art world, then it's storytelling. That is something that is really naff and bad kind of, it's not looked at as something very sober, and therefore it's extremely attractive to go into that field and explore it and use it and show that you can actually work with that. Every territory that is unpopular is, of course, always the most attractive area to work in.
Well, that's a bit actually going back to your origins, I guess, in some sense, right? Like as a writer, that goes a bit back to your origins, maybe, in theater and telling these stories and creating a kind of narrative. But maybe just a quick question, you know, this is at the Prada Foundation. So is that a piece of advice? You just create a shop. I believe you had no connection with them 20 years before. So you create some kind of crazy project and 20 years later you end up having a connection and doing a show. Is that a coincidence?
It's often how it is, isn't it? Like you start out criticizing something and then they love you. It's a sickness of the art world somehow.
Sickness of the world.
Well, maybe this is a good time. I guess some of you are eager to also ask your own questions and make your own contributions and get involved in the conversation. So the floor is yours. Anna here from our team will be passing around. She has the microphone. Just put your hand up.
Sie können auch gerne Fragen auf Deutsch stellen, wenn Ihnen das lieber ist. Und dann übersetzen wir das ganz kurz.
Yeah, hello. It was super interesting. I was wondering, since you met in a club and you came to Berlin in the 90s, I think, right? Was it correct? 90s? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we came to Berlin in 97. Yeah.
97, okay. So what influence had music and club culture on your work, or if it had any?
I mean, I think music hasn't played any direct part in our work. We never worked with sound art, for instance. It has been like an element occasionally. At the Venice pavilions, for instance, we worked with a composer to create a sort of a soundtrack, like, you know, the American composer Nico Muhly. And I don't know if even people notice it, but I think it was quite important for how people experienced the work. So we've been occasionally involving music, but it hasn't been a driving force in a way. But I think being in Berlin,
we made a couple of clubs as big installations, first in a gallery in London called Victoria Miro Gallery, and latest, which was in the end of COVID in China in 2022. We also made a big club in a museum called By Art Matters. These clubs, they were staged as clubs, and we invited a big crowd in that was not a typical art audience. And then when you would have the VIP preview and the important guests coming, they saw the leftovers of the club. But then there was no more music. The music had happened the days before when the fun was going on.
Please.
Hi, I'm Jean-Ulrich. There's an aspect of my first question that was somewhat answered with the Prada that you brought up. And I had been thinking how there are certain types of works that are being made today that are always under the threat of being sued by the companies, you know? Like, I think at a certain point, the type of work that Andy Warhol was doing would not be able to happen today. Maybe Campbell's Soup would probably sue him today. But it's interesting that Prada became a fan. And having seen the presentation, I've definitely become more of a fan of your work today. And but it makes me curious to know what you both have heard in terms of the criticism against your work. I'm really curious. I understand a little bit of it with regards to ha ha ha, that's art. But in fact, I see so much poetry in the work, and yet I know that however successful you might be, it hurts to be criticized sometimes. And I'm, you know, as an artist myself, I know what it's like to be criticized for hard work. So I'm curious if you would share a little bit of this bitchy shit, you know, gossip.
I think it helps to be two, I think, you know, like you can talk about it, at least you're not alone, you know. It creates maybe a little bit of distance somehow, but as you say, of course, it's painful, but critique can be very constructive as well, you know. It makes you realize, oh, maybe we went a bit too far this way or that way, or and this might be a sign that we should think differently, or step back, or yeah.
For the first part of the question about copyright, I mean, the fun thing is that so many photographers and other artists use Prada Marfa for their own work, so they sell photos of Prada Marfa or whatever, and we never sue anyone, like because we're not big fans of this copyright issue. For the critique, I would say, well, if you're a public figure today, you are up for shit. You can only hope you don't get cancelled. That is like kind of the best you can hope for. But the critique can be healthy. I mean, like, I would not like everyone in the world to love what I do. Then I would think I would do something wrong. I also don't want to be a dictator of the perception of my works. It's suggestions, it's platforms for acting with it in a dialogue or refusing it. I think it's healthy if you make works in your practice that is generating discussions. Fortunately, there's a lot of positive feedback as well. Otherwise, it would be really sad. But like, if it sometimes could piss off someone, I think it's good, because you start having a debate about different issues, about what should we use art for, or what should art be, or yeah.
Well, it means that it's touching a certain nerve and that people are not indifferent. I think indifference is probably much worse than people not liking your work, just like not caring about it at all. I think that's probably, for me, more of an affront if you do something and you put it out in the world and just nobody cares. Whereas I feel personally, I don't mind if people don't like, because you're touching on something and then they can disagree with you, but they're noticing it. And I think if you do something and you put it in the public sphere, you really want people to notice it, or why would you actually share it with other people, no?
I mean, anything that goes beyond this Facebook like or not like debate is worth it. I mean, like if we can discuss things beyond just rejection or being fan of, then I think it's worth all the hassle.
Hi. We were talking about collaboration earlier, and I can only imagine how elaborate these large projects must be and how many people are working on it. And I was wondering, is in your practice authorship and also craftsmanship important? And if so, can you talk about this?
Yeah, craftsmanship is, of course, very important. I mean, to us, it's very important that things are well made, and that's, of course, mostly important to communicate an idea. It only needs to reach that point, basically, where the idea is clearly communicated and can be understood. And I think we use maybe design and this quality of fabrication in a similar way, that it becomes means of communication. That it becomes easier for people to enter into the work and also enter into complicated subject matter that they might have rejected if there wasn't this opening somehow.
But do you think that comes with the polished aesthetics that you're choosing?
Sometimes, yes, it can, yeah.
It's also like, I mean, you work the way or from who you are. I mean, I think there's a certain influence of coming from neurotic Scandinavia in our practice, where everything is very kind of organized design-wise. You even have the Jacobsen chairs in kindergartens in Denmark. And of course that influences you. And there's a critique in the smoothness in our aesthetics also. There's a wish for the big collapse of modernism ideals in many of the projects that we do, where we set up the kind of perfect setting for something and then kind of collapse it at the same time.
Perfect setting for the perfect disaster.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Like the collector guy floating face down in the pool. But it's also like, an extended dialogue, even outside the studio, not only with our team in the studio, but it's with artisans in Italy or foundries in Germany, and for us, it's a great pleasure to discuss aesthetics, to discuss finishes, and work together with people who really love their craftsmanship and challenge them in some ways. So that's also due to pure pleasure that we do these kind of works.
Maybe just a very simple example can be the pool on Rockefeller Plaza. It's not, it's kind of a perfect pool. It's very well produced or fabricated with a smooth surface. It's not a fucked up pool that landed there somehow. And I think through this smoothness, it becomes more disturbing than if it was run down, like the Whitechapel Gallery that told another story and was full of dirt and was abandoned somehow.
But the dirt is perfectly produced also.
Absolutely.
And I think for the illusion to work, what Till was referring to earlier, like the surrealist trope in your work, that confrontation of odd things that wouldn't go together, if it's not perfectly executed, it just doesn't work. If you can see how the seams are constructed in a wall that's supposed to look like it was there for 50 years, then it's simply not going to work. So I think, I personally think it's very important that the production has no compromise, that it's really done to suit the idea and serve the idea properly.
I mean, I'm glad you say that. In the end, of course, we're never happy. But
perhaps we have time for one last question.
Gibt es ein Projekt, was ihr bisher noch nicht realisieren konntet, wegen quasi irgendwelche Begrenzungen, sei es finanziell? Es hat ja geklappt, den Prada-Laden in der Wüste zu bauen. Gibt es noch eine verrücktere Idee von euch?
It's about if you guys have a completely crazy question that we're not be able to execute to whatever kind of constraints, be space or budgets or whatever. But is there like a really crazy thing on your mind?
So we can do it.
It's no, but we
copy the idea.
Our production team is already having like shaky knees.
It's fun with a Prada shop because it was actually a project that we wanted to do ourselves. We initiated ourselves, and no one really wanted to fund it. First, we wanted to call it Prada Nevada because it sounded really good, and no one in Nevada wanted to give us any land. Then we got this little piece of land close to Marfa, and we fundraised the budget of the store ourselves, which is done in traditional adobe clay style that is typical for the area and super cheap to make, very sustainable but like very cheap. So sometimes I think our project looks far more expensive than they are. Actually, like our two collectors' home where we involved 23 artists were approximately 1/4 of the budget of the American pavilion that had a single artist in it at that time. So, yeah, part of our working method is also trying to make the most out of relatively limited budgets.
But I think the question is, what's on your mind? What crazy project have you not realized? I think you may be trying to avoid the answer. But
you've avoided it so well so far.
They're pitching it well, saying it's actually not expensive, so if anyone... and they find the money.
Yeah, it should be a surprise. It should be a surprise.
Well, good. So then I think we'll have to look forward to it, see what happens next. But I would like to thank you all so much for coming and being here at our In Conversation series at Hamburger Bahnhof. The next talk will be on Saturday, May 4th. It is always on the first Saturday of every month at 3 o'clock here at Hamburger Bahnhof. The next talk will be right after the opening of the Venice Biennale. Chala Ilk, the curator of the German pavilion in Venice, in conversation with Ersan Montag, one of the artists featured in the pavilion. So we're very excited about having that first take and the feedback and see how it went in Venice. It's going to be a fascinating conversation. I also would like to invite you for our next opening on Thursday evening. We are reopening the Kleio-Saale with a big, fantastic presentation by Joseph Beuys, and at the same time a solo presentation by Nama Tsabar, a wonderful artist and musician. So these two exhibitions are opening on Thursday at 7 p.m. You're all welcome to join. And 2 weeks later, the Historical Hall opens with a big installation, performative installation in the Historical Hall by Alexandra Piric. That opening also is on a Thursday, so you can come Thursday, and then 2 weeks later on Thursday, and then the following Saturday. There we also have a DJ as part of Berlin Gallery Weekend. So thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
And maybe one last thing, you can clap if you want.
Thank you.
So one last thing, which is becoming a tradition, we need to do a selfie with everyone. So can you come and stand up here? And we just have to do one very quickly, if that's okay.
Speaking of
There.
digital.
Exactly. So where's Michael? There we go. Okay. Now we can clap. Thank you.